The automated camera shuddered evenly as Major Robert Cowboy Stout's F6F Hellcat flew across Peleliu at 8,000 feet, September 12, 1944. His instructions were straightforward: document the northern landing field and get back to USS Hornet. Intelligence had guaranteed him the field was unused, likely wrecked by prior bombing sorties. Then Stout glanced below and his blood ran cold. The landing strip beneath was filled with Japanese airplanes, Mitsubishi Zeros, Nakajima bombers, scores of them arranged wingtip to wingtip. Fuel barrels piled in tidy lines, ground teams bustling about every aircraft. They weren't deserted. They were getting ready for a huge attack. Stout tallied rapidly. No less than 40 airplanes, completely armed and fueled. And he understood precisely what they were anticipating. In 3 days, 28,000 Marines were set to flood the beaches of Peleliu in one of the biggest amphibious attacks of the Pacific War. The invasion armada was already heading for the island. These 40 Japanese airplanes were placed to slaughter them ere they hit the coast. Stout's instruction was explicit: identify hostile units, transmit the location, go back to base, and allow command to determine how to react. A scout pilot's duty was to watch and inform, not to fight, particularly not solo against a whole airfield teeming with anti-aircraft weapons. But Stout also grasped military red tape. By the time he touched down, submitted his findings, and command organized an attack group, hours would go by, perhaps a whole day. The Japanese would disperse these airplanes, conceal them in embankments, or worse, send them against the armada. The Marines hitting those beaches in 3 days lacked the time for standard protocol. They required these planes eliminated now. Not the next day, now. Stout wheeled higher, examining the arrangement below. The Japanese had committed a crucial error in their hurry. The airplanes were crammed too tightly, encircled by unprotected fuel barrels. A single solid strike might ignite a chain reaction that would engulf the whole field. He inspected his munitions. 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 2,400 rounds in all. Approximately 12 seconds of continuous fire. Far from sufficient to eliminate 40 airplanes one by one, but sufficient to ignite a massive fuse. Before we go on, I am curious to find out where you are viewing from and what you've learned of the Battle of Peleliu. Post a comment below and tell me if you knew of Cowboy Stout's assault. Robert Stout wasn't an impulsive aviator. At 28 years of age, he had completed 63 combat sorties. He'd made it through dogfights with Zeros, assaulted entrenched locations under intense fire, and touched down on carriers in tempests that kept other aviators on the deck. He understood the distinction between bravery and self-destruction. What he was contemplating now straddled that line very finely. If he assaulted, each anti-aircraft gun on Peleliu would aim for him. He would be by himself, with no supporting pilots to subdue ground fire or protect his retreat. His Hellcat could withstand harm, but one fortunate hit to the motor or cockpit would plunge him into the jungle with no chance of retrieval. If he failed to attack, those 40 airplanes would take off in waves against the invasion armada. Japanese aviators would rake the landing vessels, bomb the troop carriers, and make the beaches into fields of death. The Marines would perish by the hundreds prior to setting up a foothold. Stout had witnessed the result when Marines disembarked under aerial assault. He'd provided close air support at Tarawa, where Japanese aircraft had caused chaos for the initial waves. He'd observed, powerless, as bombers aimed at packed landing vessels that were unable to steer or protect themselves. The choice required under 30 seconds. Stout shoved the throttle ahead and tilted the Hellcat into a plunge. The altitude meter spun down quickly as he fell toward the jungle cover. His strategy was straightforward: arrive quick and low, strike the fuel barrels initially, and exit before the anti-aircraft crews could follow him. At 2,000 feet, he stabilized and slammed the throttle fully forward. The Hellcat sped up to almost 400 miles per hour, the motor roaring at peak output. Trees streaked below him as he descended to just 50 feet over the jungle. The landing strip emerged abruptly through a break in the foliage. Japanese ground teams stared up, baffled, as the Hellcat thundered above. Some stopped, others leaped for safety. Not one got to their anti-aircraft stations fast enough. Stout aimed at the northern line of airplanes and pulled the trigger. All 6 machine guns began firing at once, their collective thunder overwhelming the motor. Tracers marched over the runway, punching through the slender aluminum hide of a Zero. The plane trembled from the hits, fuel gushing from torn tanks. Stout corrected his aim minimally and shot into a group of fuel barrels piled between 2 bombers. The barrels vanished under 50-caliber rounds, aviation gas detonating in a huge fireball that swallowed both airplanes. The detonation was larger than Stout expected. Fire jumped 50 feet high. The shockwave buffeted his Hellcat as he yanked up sharply. In his wake, the blaze expanded with frightening velocity. The first flaming Zero lit the airplane station next to it. That blaze moved to another, then another, every blast fueling the subsequent one. In moments, half the northern line was consumed. Japanese ground teams fled everywhere, forsaking any effort to rescue the airplanes. Anti-aircraft crews at last got to their stations and started shooting, but Stout was already ascending, jinking to ruin their aim. Tracers curved by his cockpit. He felt hits vibrate through the fuselage as 20mm shells tore through his rear section. Caution lights flashed on the dashboard, but the motor continued running well. He tilted sharply right, climbing higher and looping back. Beneath him, the destruction surpassed his hopes. Almost 20 airplanes were ablaze, the fire moving over the runway like a river of flame. Dense black smoke billowed upward, seen for miles. Yet on the southern part of the field, no less than 20 more airplanes sat unharmed. Stout checked his munitions, halfway depleted. Perhaps 6 seconds of shooting time remaining. The anti-aircraft crews were prepared now, following him as he wheeled. Returning for a second run was inviting them to shoot him down. He flipped upside down and plunged regardless. This time, the anti-aircraft shooting was instant and fierce. Tracers packed the air nearby him like furious hornets. He dodged left, then right, never keeping a direct path long enough for crews to aim true. The Hellcat trembled under further hits, metal ripping someplace in the airframe. Stout arrived from a new direction, aiming for the bombers on the southern part of the field. His leftover munitions pounded into the airplanes, tearing control surfaces and piercing fuel tanks. He guided his shots over a fuel truck, which detonated with sufficient power to toss a close bomber onto its top. The follow-up blasts began instantly. Flaming gas from the truck reached piled munition boxes, which exploded in a quick sequence of blasts. The bomber's own bombs ignited, ripping the airplanes apart from the inside. In seconds, the southern line was ablaze as intensely as the northern. Stout's guns went quiet, depleted. He'd shot every bullet. The Hellcat seemed unresponsive as he ascended, harmed control surfaces resisting him. Additional caution lights. Something was dripping, leaving a faint trail of smoke. But beneath him, the whole landing strip was a conflagration. Every airplane, every fuel barrel, every building was engulfed by flames. The smoke plume climbed thousands of feet, indicating the location like a burial pyre. Stout aimed the harmed Hellcat toward the sea and carefully flew it back to USS Hornet. The hydraulics were giving out, rendering the controls stiff and sluggish. Oil pressure was falling. He was uncertain the landing gear would deploy, but at minimum the motor was still going. The trip back seemed lengthier than the assault. Adrenaline subsided, supplanted by the awareness of what he had just achieved. He had blatantly violated orders. In place of capturing images and coming back as instructed, he'd single-handedly assaulted a whole airfield. A court-martial was a genuine prospect. So was being reprimanded by each officer from him to the admiral. But the other option, seeing those 40 airplanes slaughter the Marines, would have been more terrible than any penalty the Navy could administer. The Hornet showed up on the horizon. Stout contacted the tower and described his condition. Airplane harmed, unsure of landing gear, asking for immediate landing. The carrier pivoted into the breeze and emptied the deck. His landing gear deployed, but just partly. One wheel failed to lock. He approached fast and snagged the second cable, the harmed Hellcat hitting the deck with enough force to bend metal. Deck teams descended on the airplane instantly, stunned by the harm. The tail end was torn up. The airframe had more than 12 holes. The paint was burned black from going through detonations. Stout got out of the cockpit and saw himself before a group of officers. The air boss demanded to know why he'd come back with battle harm from a scouting mission. The squadron leader wanted to know why he'd violated radio silence. The intelligence official wanted to know what on earth had occurred over Peleliu. Stout's account was brief. The airfield wasn't deserted. It was filled with airplanes getting ready to assault the invasion armada. He'd eliminated them, every one. 40 airplanes vanished. 8 minutes, beginning to end. The officers gazed at him. The intelligence official requested he say the number again. 40 airplanes, eliminated by one aviator in one airplane? That sounded unbelievable. Scouting pictures verified it the following day. The northern landing strip at Peleliu was totally wrecked. Not one airplane stayed functional. Airborne images revealed the charred wreckage of precisely 40 Japanese aircraft strewn over a blackened runway. Fuel stores were craters, buildings were ruins. Intelligence officials updated their evaluation of Japanese air power on Peleliu. Rather than confronting 40 airplanes on D-Day, the Marines would land on the beaches with total air dominance. The Japanese air danger was eradicated by one aviator, who declined to obey orders. The Navy gave Stout the Navy Cross, the second most prestigious medal for battle bravery. The commendation lauded his exceptional heroism and offensive fighting attitude in assaulting superior hostile forces by himself. His choice to fight had squarely saved American lives, but the Battle of Peleliu that came next was savage nonetheless. The Marines disembarked on September 15, 1944, and at once confronted some of the most ferocious combat in the Pacific. Japanese units had entrenched the island's coral peaks and caverns, making every location into a lethal fortress. The fight endured over 2 months and cost almost 2,000 American lives. Still, lacking Stout's assault, the losses would have been much greater. Those 40 Japanese airplanes would have struck during the exposed initial hours of the invasion, when Marines were crammed in landing vessels and transport ships. Air assaults on amphibious landings were ruinous because the soldiers couldn't find cover or steer. Military historians subsequently estimated that Stout's lone assault likely saved between 500 and 1,000 Marine lives on the initial day. His 8 minutes of battle had achieved what an entire squadron of bombers might have managed, and he'd done it at precisely the vital instant before the Japanese could scatter their airplanes. Following the war, Stout went back to California and lived peacefully. He seldom talked about what he'd accomplished over Peleliu. His children were raised knowing their father had been in the Pacific, but they didn't find out the specifics until decades passed. The Navy Cross remained in a drawer, not shown on any wall. Friends who knew him depicted a man who was uneasy with focus or compliments. When questioned about the assault, he would minimize it. "I spotted planes that required destroying, so I destroyed them," he'd state. Any aviator would have done likewise, but not all aviators would have. The majority would have obeyed orders, radioed back, and let command manage it through standard procedures. That red tape method would have allowed the Japanese time to disperse their airplanes or send them. Stout's readiness to violate orders and rely on his own assessment created the difference. His tale stayed mostly obscure outside military flying groups until historians found the mission records decades after. When academics cross-checked his Navy Cross commendation with Japanese files and airborne images, they grasped the complete importance of what he'd achieved. 1 man, 1 airplane, 8 minutes, 40 hostile planes eliminated, possibly 1,000 lives rescued. The assault showed something that military planners examine to this day: the worth of initiative on the tactical level. Stout couldn't have been sure for definite that his choice was right. He was speculating about the Japanese intentions, wagering that his evaluation of the danger was precise and risking his life on his capacity to perform the assault. Everything about the circumstance argued for prudence. Obey orders, inform back, allow someone senior to choose. But Stout grasped that at times the individual on the scene, viewing the predicament with their own eyes, has superior judgment than leaders studying maps miles distant. His readiness to rely on his own evaluation, even when it involved blatantly violating orders, personified the concept of commander's intent. The Navy hadn't instructed him to assault that landing strip, but they had dispatched him to safeguard the invasion force. He grasped the purpose behind his mission and adjusted when conditions required it. The Navy acknowledged this by giving him the Navy Cross instead of court-martialing him. They grasped that strict compliance to orders would have led to catastrophe. Stout's defiance was, in fact, the supreme form of honoring intent over direction. Contemporary fighter pilots examined Stout's assault in tactical training classes, not solely for the flying abilities it showed, but for the decision-making under stress. The military instructs that sometimes obeying orders precisely means losing chances that won't appear again. The assault also showed flawless target selection. Stout didn't expend munitions attempting to eliminate 40 airplanes one by one. He spotted the fuel barrels as the crucial weakness and capitalized on it. One round in the correct spot achieved more than 1,000 rounds in the incorrect spots. His method from several directions, arriving low and quick to reduce vulnerability to anti-aircraft fire, revealed tactical complexity beyond just aiming and firing. He'd scrutinized the defenses, organized his assault passes, and performed them despite receiving harm. And vitally, he'd understood when to cease. After depleting his munitions, he didn't linger attempting to evaluate harm or searching for more targets. He left. The mission was finished. Remaining longer would have been needless danger. All of these choices occurred in moments, under fire, with no time for measured consideration. Stout's training and background allowed him to make instant judgments that each proved right. Robert Cowboy Stout passed away in 2005 at age 89. His relatives at last shared his account publicly, and military historians hurried to save the specifics before they vanished. The mission records, scouting pictures, and Navy Cross citation all verified what appeared nearly too theatrical to accept. In the last assessment, Stout's assault over Peleliu ranks as one of the most triumphant lone strikes in naval aviation history. No different single aviator eliminated as many hostile airplanes in one sortie during World War II. His 8 minutes of battle stopped what would have been a ruinous air assault on the Peleliu invasion. The Marines who disembarked on those beaches never realized that a Navy aviator had violated orders to rescue their lives. They battled through hell on that coral island, confronting Japanese defenders in entrenched locations that made every yard of ground into a fight. But at minimum, they didn't confront 40 airplanes raking them as they attempted to get to shore. At times, the most courageous thing a serviceman can do is decline to obey orders, not from cowardice or defiance, but because the circumstance requires action that strict compliance to procedure would stop. Stout grasped this innately. When faced with a decision between doing what he was instructed and doing what had to be done, he selected the mission over the instructions. His legacy endures in every tactical training class that instructs initiative over compliance, adjustment over inflexibility, and faith in the assessment of people on the scene. The military learned from Stout and aviators like him that at times the best path of action is the one no one instructed you to take. The next time you confront a predicament where obeying the rules feels incorrect, where strict protocol clashes with clear need, recall Cowboy Stout wheeling over that landing strip. He understood what had to occur. He understood it would penalize him if he was incorrect, and he did it regardless because the other option was worse.